My name is Christia V. Daniels Adair. My husband's name is Albert H. Adair. We got married in 1918 in Victoria County, Texas, and he was a brakeman for the Missouri Pacific Railroad. I, Christia, was born on October 22nd, 1893 in Victoria, Texas, to my parents Handy Daniels and Ada Crosby Daniels. My family and I resided in Edna, Texas, which was a very important place to us all. I was one of 4 children. My 2 younger brothers are Webster Daniels, who lived from 1895 to 1974, and Gus Daniels, who lived from 1905 to 1976. They did not follow any professional lines, but they were both wonderful husbands, brothers, and good men. My brother Webster Daniels was the only documented person in the family to have served in a war. He was a U.S. veteran of World War I. He was for a short period of time hospitalized in San Antonio, Texas, in a local hospital there in relation to the war. World War I began in 1914. It was documented on July 5, 1917, that over 700,000 African Americans had registered for military service. However, they were barred from the Marines and served only in menial roles in the Navy. As you can see with the pictures I have included as a representation of African American men and the Navy during World War I, the ropes in the pictures indicate them being on boats during this time as being part of the Navy. I also had one older sister that I respected and looked up to as a second mom. No pictures of her are available, though. My paternal grandfather started a hauling business that my father inherited. The business was used as a cotton and oil hauling business, but they also hauled a lot more. Edna is in Jackson County and is quite a farming area. There were many black men who owned black land and livestock, and my father was part of that community. My mother worked for my father in the business as she cooked breakfast and dinner every day for the work crew and provided them with fresh linens for the next workday. Although my parents had a successful hauling business, we were never rich, but we also didn't struggle as much as some of our neighbors, but my parents made sure that we had what we needed. All other jobs and my family members were unknown, but it is safe to assume that due to their timeline they would have been slaves and forced into unskilled labor as field hands for production of cotton, corn, and sugar, though some slaves at the time lived and worked on large plantations or in urban areas where they engaged in more skilled forms of labor as cooks, blacksmiths, and carpenters. The American Civil War was a war in the United States between the Union and the Confederacy. This war taking place in 1816. I was not alive yet, but both of my parents would have been very young at this time, so their early life experience was that of some of the few who first lived through the early stages of freedom from the abolishment of slavery after the Civil War. Things were still transitioning, though, so segregation, discrimination, and all of those things were still very present during their time period. I don't have a lot of historical references from my grandparents or great-grandparents, as not much information was documented on them the time that they were alive. My mother's parents died before I ever met them, as my mother was raised by godparents. My mother's father was of Caucasian descent. Not a lot of information was passed on about him, but he was said to be very in love with my grandmother, who was an African-American woman. She sadly died in childbirth along with the baby. Due to my grandfather being Caucasian, he was on the other side of slavery, so at the time in the mid-1800s, it was not accepted by society for them to be in an interracial relationship, especially in the South. My godparents acted as my grandparents. My godfather was Professor John W. Frazier, co-founder of Samuel Houston College, which was a freedman aid school supported by the Methodist Church. During the time Professor Frazier was born, he was more likely to be born into slavery and witnessed a lot of injustices. When slavery was abolished, he worked to start a freedmen's college for those who were in a similar position to himself and still affected by slavery, especially being in the South. My godfather came to my hometown Edna, saw that the education system at the time wasn't the best, told my father that he thought that we should go to Samuel Houston College instead, and after agreeing, my brother and I went there for our elementary and high school work there. This gave me the experience of getting a better education and allowed me to further pursue a higher degree. After Austin, I went to Prairie View State Normal and Industrial College, now known as A&M University, to get my teaching degree. I finished and then taught for 2 years in Edna, my childhood town. My parents, on the other hand, never had much schooling and were considered illiterate education-wise, but they were intelligent nonetheless and upheld strong in morals and maintained a successful and happy family and home. Organized schooling for African Americans was rare before 1865. That being said, the only schooling my grandparents or great-grandparents would have gotten would have been from the slave owners or overseers if they chose to do so. The information on whether or not they did is unknown. The only member of my family that would have went to public school was my maternal grandfather, my mother Ada's father, as he was a Caucasian man and schooling was made available to them. My parents brought us up on strong Christian morals, though, and I was baptized in a Methodist church at age 11. My mother, father, godparents, and grandparents were all Methodists. After moving to Kingsville to start my own Sunday school church, my involvement in the civil rights movement really began. In 1920, my husband and I were living in Kingsville when presidential candidate Warren G. Harding made a campaign stop. I was teaching at the time, so I assembled some of my school children to come and meet him and shake hands. After his speech, Harding reached over my African American students I had brought with me to shake the hands of the white students behind me. This is the time I knew I no longer wanted to identify with the Republican Party if this is what that meant. This incident served as a catalyst for growing my interest in civil rights. I later helped found the Houston County Democrats, an integrated alternate to the county's segregated Democratic organization. In 1966, I was one of the first 2 blacks elected to the state Democratic Committee, but declined the offer after the state partly refused to seat the Harris County delegation and agreed to only seat its 2 black members. I was executive secretary for the Houston chapter of the NAACP, an organization that played an important role in the Texas civil rights movement. I also took roles in campaigns to desegregate the Houston airport, library, golf courses, veterans hospital, city buses, and department stores. I once insisted on using a white-only dressing room, an incident I became very well known for. I was one of the first African American judges in Harris County. I served as a precinct judge for Houston's 3rd Ward. In addition to later being abducted into the Texas Women's Hall of Fame, Harris County also dedicated a beautiful park named the Christia Dog Park in my honor that resides in the Houston area.